Welcome to everyone listening to UNESCO's Inclusive Policy Lab podcast series. Today we have another expert conversation run by the lab as part of our expert series focusing on COVID, its social policy implications, and the idea of a post-COVID reset. That means, from a UNESCO perspective, obviously a reset along a more equitable and inclusive path. As in all of these podcasts, we'll be talking on the one hand about concrete policy measures seen by our invited experts as being conducive to such an equitable recovery, looking at specific real-world examples as well as more general arguments. And we'll also be looking at the data and the knowledge that we have or would need to support, inform, justify, or possibly invalidate proposed policy shifts. Our expert today is Elise Klein, Senior Lecturer at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University. Elise, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So today we will be focusing on Australia's unconditional transfer experiment, how it links to the idea of a universal basic income, how it performed, what we can learn from it, perhaps also how it is developing and where it might go. This is the first time we've had the opportunity to discuss Australia in this series. We've had a lot of discussion about the US, about certain parts of Europe, about South Asia, and this will be therefore a very complementary and very enlightening discussion. And of course, Elise, even if we're focusing on Australia, your insights into other countries will be much appreciated. This discussion at the global level is very much a comparative discussion. So, you, Elise, have recently completed research on Australia's freshly implemented unconditional supplement for citizens. You've researched this scheme and have fresh data on it. Could you perhaps explain to our listeners how this scheme connects to a universal basic income and how it differs perhaps from the idea of a universal basic income? How was it designed? What was it meant to achieve? And insofar as we have sufficient information at this stage, what have been the outcomes?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, the first thing to say is that that it wasn't quite an unconditional transfer, but I'll get to that just shortly. But just to sort of paint the picture of the sort of Australian social security and labour market scene, that Australia has had, prior to COVID, probably about a 5% unemployment rate. However, there is a higher underemployment rate. So people who are answering the question in the Australian census of if they could have more work, would you take it, but you just can't find enough hours. And that's, in the sort of around the 13% mark, and it's much higher for young people. On top of that, we have a very punitive social security system. So like other Western nations, this kind of idea of welfare conditionality has been a long-standing idea in the sort of Australian policy psyche, if you like, where we have conditions not just on what you have to do to get your welfare payments, so programs like work for the dole, so needing to show your willingness to do all sorts of activities to get your income, but and particularly how these work for the dole and these conditions impact particularly First Nations people. Australia is a settler colony. We have many First Nations and tensions over sovereignty and land continue very much in the sort of Australian political landscape. And so welfare has long been used as a tool of assimilation for First Nations people and a tool of I guess, disciplinary action against First Nations people. And work for the dole is definitely a tool in that respect, but it's also used more broadly. So there's conditions on what you have to do to get money, but also Australia has conditions on what you can do when you get Social Security, which is this idea of income management. And so your money is quarantined on a particular bank card that is controlled by a privatised organisation, and you can only spend it on certain items. And so that's this idea of income management, which is also targeted at First Nations people as well as non-First Nations people. So this is, I'm just setting the scene of the very punitive Social Security landscape of Australia. I should also say that the rate of Social Security since 1994 hasn't risen, and so before COVID hit, it was people receiving it found themselves well below the poverty line and very hard to survive on the Social Security payments. So that was the landscape until COVID hit. And so when COVID hit, there was a lot of lockdowns. So businesses had to stall their activities. The borders started to close, and basically people started to lose their jobs. And the unemployment rate in its peak got to about 7.1%, which sounds low, but that's because the Australian government did two major policies in this period, which completely reversed their kind of position in the policy landscape up until that point. So the first policy was this idea called the job keeper, and that effectively paid employees to keep staff. And that's why that unemployment rate seems low, is because the amount of people who would have lost their jobs were actually covered by this job keeper, in that they got to stay employed technically, even though they weren't doing much work. They weren't going in, they just got this payment every fortnight. So that was the job keeper. So it's estimated that it almost hid up to about 2 million people from falling into unemployment. And then you have what our research was focusing on, was this payment called the job seeker payment. So effectively, this payment was paid to people who weren't eligible for JobKeeper, who found themselves in Social Security, and for all the people that were already on Social Security, they also found themselves being called and under this idea of job seeker. And what that meant was that they were paid a supplement of $550 a fortnight, so people who had previously been on unemployment benefits found themselves for the first time for a long time above the poverty level with their payments, plus those welfare conditionality, that work for the dole, ceased. So they suspended that also. So effectively, people who had been stigmatised and have been subject to all sorts of punitive measures as part of the Australian Social Security were given enough money to survive, plus they were given their time back through the mutual obligation. And this was where myself and my colleagues found a really important moment to understand what was going on for people here. And so we conducted some research with people on this job seeker payment, understanding what it meant for their lives, and particularly people who had been on Social Security payments for some time and before these measures came into play. Basically, what we found was a range of different insights. So one is that with the extra money, people found themselves being able to meet their basic needs. So being able to buy food enough to last the week without having to ration food, being able to pay for their medicines and not have to ration medicines, and being able to pay down their debts that they had accrued because of living under financial stress. And so, if I could just quote a couple of people here. So somebody who had been on unemployment benefits for some time says, I was able to get medical and dental issues sorted out that I'd forgot about for literally years beforehand. I was able to buy new clothes for myself, not having to ration foods and meds, being able to keep my son in new clothes. Another person said I could buy more groceries and not worry about paying bills in the same week. People also reported around being able to look after their kids better, but feeling like they could provide better for their kids without feeling like they had to ration, that they had enough money to be able to do that. And then also their psychological health increased too. People talk very much about not having to live under the psychological stress of not having enough to keep the family going, to keep themselves going, and worrying about where the next meal would come from. So this, shows that the rate of payments matter to people. The other thing that I think is interesting about this study is that people who had been subject to conditionalities also got their time back. So instead of it being filled up by policies around needing to do work for the dole and other, make work activities, that they were able to have their time back. And people reported various impacts about that also, including about psychological health, so not having to be under stigma, not having anxiety of being followed up by the agency in Australia is called Centrelink, being hounded by them, to have to turn up, not having to live under the threat of being sanctioned for not turning up to activities, or if there's issues with the activities, being able to have their time back. But also we asked what they were able to do with their time. And what was interesting is that people talk very much about the extra time gave them space. So time, not just in terms of minutes, but also, I guess, mental space, mental time to think and to be strategic about how they wanted to go and what did they want to do in the future. Some people started small initiatives, small enterprises in the community. A lot of people did a lot of social reproductive work, looking after neighbours, doing volunteering and work in the community, looking after elderly people, and then others use their time and also the extra funds to invest in further study for their economic futures, that they looked and spent more time working on their CV, and trying to sort of think about entering the labour market on their own terms, and having space and time to be able to think through what that might mean. Doesn't mean that those initiatives, those particularly the ones trying to get into work, have resulted in work, as Australia is still very much in a recession and jobs are hard to come by still, but that people with that extra time were able to invest in this. So, I mean, what this sort of shows is that with economic security, and it isn't a universal basic income, it was conditional, and it wasn't universal, but yet still with people with not having conditions, not having conditions on what people have to do to be able to get their money and have economic security. Our research is suggesting that people give back a lot into the community. People do all sorts of social, reproductive and care labour, but also volunteering and community work. People talked about doing advocacy work in their time. And then also there's people who reported very much about trying to look for work and be more strategic in how they engaged with the labour market. So I think these are, is interesting. I think it also shows how easy it is for a government that has been ideologically focused in a very particular direction, with literally with the sign of the pen of the treasurer, that money were released to many people who had for years and years been stigmatised as welfare dependent, and showed that actually they contribute to all sorts of activities that society needs and is actually dependent on. And so I think that is very interesting.
Thank you very much. It is indeed, because at one level, the benefits you described of unconditional income schemes are exactly what their advocates have been arguing for years, based on both principled arguments and some evidence of real-world schemes in various places. Yet the resistance has been incredibly strong for a whole series of reasons, which, as you said, are deeply ideological. It reminds me of the well-known passage in The Road to Wigan Pier, George Orwell, 1936, hardly an up-to-date tome, which is a lot about welfare conditionality, and quotes the phrase that Orwell claims to have heard on many occasions: "It's pointless giving miners baths because they'll only use them to keep coal in." In other words, the idea that people who need help need to be punished for needing help is deeply ingrained in the whole design of benefit, welfare, social provision systems. But that creates a paradox. Why? How could it change so fast? Was it because, and just sketching some hypotheses to invite you to give your own view on this, one possible argument is COVID was such a shock, such a systemic shock, that it basically swept the board of pre-existing prejudices and views and created a space for improvisation, which isn't always a good thing, but at least allowed things to be done in ways that perhaps wouldn't have been possible even a couple of years ago. That also perhaps suggests that it might not be a durable change, and that it could go very quickly back to the status quo ante. Another possibility at the opposite end of the spectrum is that the concerns about the administrative inefficiencies and counterproductive social and individual consequences of very strict conditionalities were actually well known, but it needed something to tip policymakers over the edge, finally recognizing that schemes that were known not to work would have to change in new circumstances. And of course, there could also be the possibility of ideological shifts. People have genuinely, particularly perhaps on the political right, changed their views on these issues. Maybe. I don't know if there's any evidence for that. And finally, and you referred to this in the early part of what you said earlier, the connection with other aspects of politics, particularly the politics of First Nations, as you indicated, which are very important in areas other than social policy and create a climate that might be favorable to policy change in this particular area. So you can sketch all kinds of hypotheses. It's difficult to choose between them in Europe, for instance. How does it look from Australia? Is this a real fundamental ideological shift, a set of improvisations, or something that is specific to the social policy area and reflects known drawbacks and deficiencies of the welfare system?
This story has more to it in that it's not moving in a good direction when you look at those kinds of results. So it was a temporary measure, and so there was hope that the government would keep these payments high, or livable at least, and that mutual obligations would remain off the table. But yet, when we were doing the research, actually that $550 supplement was reduced by $300 a fortnight. So people then got $250 a fortnight. So people went from $99 a day to $57 a day. And people reported during our research, already people having to start to ration, already stressed about how they were going to be able to provide for their children. And those gains that were made, people reported having to pull back on. So since the Australian government has announced at the end of this month that the whole supplement will stop, which will mean effectively that the payment, and they've announced a small raise to the payment, which actually isn't a raise at all. It comes down to $44 a day because the supplement ends, and then the original payment, which was $40 a day, they've said we'll raise that to $44 a day. Australia's a very expensive place to live, and that is this these announcements are very concerning. So it was temporary, which is, of course, very dispiriting for a lot of people who, for the first time, felt human again. I mean, these are the kinds of responses people were talking about. The other interesting thing is that we compared people's responses to people who didn't get the supplement but were people who had were on JobKeeper, or were able to continue working during during COVID, who reported all sorts of negative experiences through COVID, from the stress of lockdowns. And this contrasted very differently to people that were on the supplement, who for a long time had been persecuted and had felt very, stigmatized. They actually had a positive experience during COVID because of the supplement. So it shows just how far pushed back or pushed under their experiences of life is because of the social security system. And when people had these measures, they had a positive experience, whereas, the general population who, I guess the middle class, if you like, found it much more difficult under COVID. But their general experience is very far from those on social security. So having said all of that, I mean, it was a moment in time, but it does show how quickly things can change. And it does show that when forced, governments can make these decisions, and ideological governments can make these decisions. If only we could see them keep them. On the issue of First Nations, another interesting thing to note is that in Australia, in the 70s, there was a program implemented that was quite like a basic income for First Nations people, particularly living remotely. It was called the Community Development Employment Projects. And so block amounts of money were given to community organisations to pay people a wage for work. Now, work here is because employment is a very narrow concept. Feminists have been saying this for a long time, but so have First Nation scholars, where work can mean a much broader array of activities, productive activities, care of country. So First Nations people, very deep, important connections with the land, care of community, and of course care of children and elderly, and maintaining culture amidst a very punitive settler colonial environment. And so these block grants were given to remote communities, and people were paid a wage to do work in a very broad sense. Now, people did a lot of that work, but then other people, for whatever reason, couldn't work. So, may have been ill, or may have been doing other certain activities, and they were paid nonetheless. And so my work with Professor John Altman in the Northern Territory, was documenting how these payments acted like a basic income, because they were paid, even if people did these activities or not, people were still paid the money, and it acted like a basic income. The sad story to that is that from the 2000s onwards, the consecutive Australian federal governments have taken a much more punitive approach to First Nations people, and that program has been scaled back, and it's been transferred into a work for the dole, a very, very punitive work for the dole, more punitive than the non remote programs, non-First Nations programs. And poverty levels have increased because of that, and also unemployment levels have increased because of that. So, we have examples here, but the ability for that ideological shift, that deep mindset in the sort of settler psyche of obsession with work and needing to contribute in very particular terms, in terms of employment, really undermines people's economic security.
There are, thank you very much. There are some things that you've alluded to, but not gone into any detail on, that I'd like to probe, if you allow me.
Sure.
One is financing. I imagine there was no specific financing method for the emergency schemes in line with what was done elsewhere. But to what extent have discussions about how unconditional schemes are to be financed played on particularly the durability, and in this case, absence of durability. As you know, there are some very interesting discussions, both in scholarly circles and in policy circles, about creating financing schemes for minimum income that would allow it to be both more sustainable and more politically legitimate. For instance, tying it to a carbon tax, which is something we talked in detail about in a previous podcast in this series. A second thing you alluded to but didn't mention explicitly is the gender dimension. And I'd be interested if you could say a bit more explicitly about what your research has revealed about the gendering both of the inequalities embedded in conditional schemes and the effects, positive, negative, or even neutral effects on the gendering of unconditional schemes.
Sure. So, I mean, on the financing, what is, so the sort of political landscape prior to COVID, the government has been desperate to pay off deficit. And so elections have been won and lost on these ideas of, we are the economic managers, we will get Australia back into the black, and be in front of so the idea of debt, which is, of course, is very contested, has been highly politicised. Now, when COVID hit, the federal government signed, one of the biggest budgets that has been seen. I think maybe even the biggest post, the war period. So all of a sudden, huge amounts of money were found, and this whole idea of debt has completely disappeared off the political landscape. Although journalists have tried to sort of put that to the Treasurer, to the Prime Minister, and they've been able to say, well, no, this was an emergency scenario. But even after, so now they have just released a budget of sort of the post-COVID recovery. Again, it's a very large budget that is looking at amounts of money that are just far beyond any budget that has been released since the war period. And so I say this to say that there is money, they can find money, and these ideas of what being able to afford the economic security for people, it really is a political framing issue. Now, some of those payments that have been the most expensive has been the JobKeeper payment that paid employers to keep on their employees. The job seeker amount was much less. I mean, colleagues and I have looked at this for a long time and have, proposed other basic income ideas previously, and before COVID, and looked at the amounts of tax cuts to businesses and sort of the elite of Australian society would cover a livable income guarantee for people in Australia. So, these ideas around financing are very politicised, and these ideas about scarcity and the inability to provide people economic security because of these concerns of debt. I think this COVID period has shown how much they are on shaky ground, and how much they can find political reasons to spend those kinds of money. On gender, look, with the COVID supplement, a lot of the people in our research were actually single mums, and so they definitely reported how much the extra payment, but also the reduction or the suspension of mutual obligations completely changed their lives. And so whilst we have work for the dole, we also have a program called Parents Next, which targets single mums, actually. So it looks at people that haven't been in the labour force, women in the labour force after 6 months, and it requires them to come to welfare conditionality programs, activities, make work kind of activities. And the assumption, of course, is they're not working. But in reality, of course, they're working, that they are looking after, they're the single carer for children. And, care, unpaid childcare is vital for the economy to even exist. That, if I can put it crudely, you don't have the next generation of taxpayers unless someone's there to raise the children. So people are treated as if they are welfare dependent, but yet actually the economy and society are dependent on their unpaid labour. And so when these women were given the supplement and also their time back, they were able, like I said, to be able to provide more, feel like they could provide more for their children. I mean, can't see it in front of me, but one of the quotes that came from the research was about a woman who had to ration her child's milk, the bottled milk for her child, which is really, really, quite an awful situation for someone to find them to be put in. But also being able to, have time to be able to spend with their kids without feeling like they were being a bad mum. And that's what these kinds of welfare conditionality programs do to people. So, feeling dignified and being able to be there with their kids, I think is, that is a different experience to people, the middle class and how the middle class responded during COVID, because they were, childcare centres closed down, and so people, and particularly women, had to take on looking after their kids in the home as well as working from home, and so their reports of the COVID experience were very different. But that is a contrast to people who have been so dehumanised for so long, being given freedom back again, and what a difference that made to people's lives.
Thank you. So we've been talking a lot about Australia, which is not a criticism, of course, because it was the whole point. But nonetheless, given what is specific about the Australian case and what is perhaps generalizable, what would you see as lessons that could be learned from the various things we've been discussing beyond the specifics of the Australian situation? And of course, we're particularly interested, if you want to comment on this, on how minimum income schemes, whether UBI or some other version of minimum income, can play out in developing countries.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I think that this research feeds into, which is a debate, or not really, I mean, it's a sort of an argument in the basic income circles, is just how narrow the ideas of employment and employment as work are, and how people contribute in very broad ways to the society and the economy. And so, I mean, feminists have been saying this for a long time. I also pointed out before that First Nations people point at this for a long time. So this obsession with the institution of employment as the way in which people get economic security really needs to be rethought, because here are a whole lot of people who have been long stigmatised, and this within a society that believes that treating people in a generous way through social security is an impediment for people to be productive. Hence, they need to be treated with stigma and welfare conditionality and low payments. Actually shows that that's not quite the case at all. In fact, people contribute in various ways, and have done for a long time, and have done in this time of COVID. So I think that's a very important point that I think our research speaks to, and it speaks into these broader discussions around why do we link economic security with the institution of employment, particularly because, and this goes to your question about the global south, that in the institution of employment has not been a promise that has been achieved for the majority of the world, that the majority of the world live and survive on an informal economy where work is precarious and highly insecure, and so and so people are having to survive in a very difficult environment, and so there are development policies that see this space as a very entrepreneurial space, but I think that's almost a bit cruel in that people, yes, are creative and yes, are trying to make ends meet, but because they're trying to survive. And so, the need to offer economic security across the board, I think, is more important than ever. And I think, that is a really great contribution of what basic income is providing.
We've talked a lot about policy issues, which is in many ways what we want to focus on in the Inclusive Policy Lab, hence the name. But there are also some really interesting research level issues that you've referred to and that I'd like in the closing part of this discussion to look at a little bit. One of the challenges we have, particularly in setting up the right kinds of policy-oriented or policy-relevant discussions, is producing the kinds of data and more generally the kinds of information that will convince people with sort of prima facie negative views about the benefits of unconditional income schemes, that in fact those benefits are both real and significant. You've described in a very interesting way, certainly for me as a social scientist, the ways in which your research has given you granular access to people's experiences, their voices, their understanding of their own situation, and how particular schemes have provided benefits for them, or the rollback of those schemes has put burdens upon them. At the same time, no research methodology can capture everything. What are the gaps that you would really like to see addressed, whether in qualitative research or at the more quantitative level? What are the things you'd really want to know and that you hope someone would either support you in doing or do if it's not the area you would like to focus on yourself? And this also connects to the policy level question or the public debate question. What do we need to know about these issues that we currently don't?
Yeah, I mean, look, as a researcher, you always want to do more. So, basic income, scholars have been thinking about trials for quite some time. And so there has been an emergence of trials across, various parts of the world. And I think that's exciting. I will say, though, I think, trials, data is always used politically. And so, I think whilst trials are important because, there's a lot of interest in them and people, can see and can hear the changes that these kinds of unconditional payments can bring for people at an individual and a social level. Data can be manipulated and politicised, and I think we saw that with the Canadian trial just recently. That change of government came in and the trials stopped. Even here in Australia, COVID, the numbers stopped increasing, and there's been some sort of steadiness here for a while, and so job keeper has been wound back and conditionalities come in. So data can be used very politically. So I guess I think what I would just like to see is these things being legislated within countries. Carl, I think it's Carl Widerquist, talks about the amount of energy that goes into putting together a trial. Why not use that energy into just rolling out a permanent basic income? And I think that's a very important and interesting question, given the ways in which even great experiments can be politicised, data can be interpreted in various ways. So I think there's a question here which sort of, I guess, straddles the policy research space is why not put the energy into rollout and permanent rollouts?
Okay. That critical perspective on data is, of course, very important for the kind of space that we occupy as an intergovernmental organization, connecting knowledge production and knowledge communities to the policy process. Are qualitative approaches, which allow, shall we say, stories to emerge not from the way the data is manipulated in the general sense, not necessarily the negative sense, but from the research itself, and particularly from the voices of the people concerned by what the research is about, is qualitative data somehow less susceptible to political manipulation because of its methods, because it's more inclusive and participatory, because it's less definitive, because it doesn't create the illusion of certainty that numbers tend to provide? Is it something like that that's implicit in what you were just saying about the problems with data?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Look, I think it can be, but it also, of course, can be politicized. But I'll say this, because one of my concerns that I've had with basic income, and particularly in the way it often gets presented, is that it's a sort of homogenous idea, and that it's a technical fix, that if you just do X, Y, and Z, that, you know, A, B, and C will happen. And these processes are way more political. And I think, and this is, you know, research that myself and my colleague Liz Folkesman at University of Oxford have been working on, is thinking critically about the politics involved in a basic income. You know, it's you know, a very exciting idea, but to think about the experiences, the relations of power that underpin that, and that definitely speaks to your question about the role of qualitative research. And how it can talk about the stories, the sort of conditions, the contingent conditions of impacts, you know, the genealogies of and the histories and the life stories that come into these often presented technical fixes. And so I do see definitely a role for qualitative data, but I mean, of course, it can be politicized. And, you know, power, of course, comes into all generations of knowledge. But I do see a role for qualitative research in telling the sort of more complex stories behind, you know, policies that are trying to create economic security for people.
Thanks. These are fascinating issues. It leads me to perhaps a final question or a comment that you can treat as a question if you wish to, or simply not respond to if you don't wish to, which is that data itself perhaps needs a critical perspective in light of the new capacities we have to produce bottom-up data. It's very clear that our tradition of data collection, going back to the invention of statistics as the science of the state in 18th century Prussia, has been statistics as a top-down set of mechanisms, procedures, and institutions designed to inform the government about its population, with a hint of ownership and control in the its, and of course designed to be used precisely to control that population. First, historically, to control its military capacity by making sure that no young men avoided military service. Later in the 19th century, when public health was invented, ensuring the health of the population in line with what were taken from a top-down perspective to be the guidelines of what should be a healthy population, and moving into the 20th century, all sorts of other variables to do with things as diverse as education and skills, and of course issues around political conformity and control of territory. But it doesn't have to be that way. And perhaps new approaches to data driven by social media, by artificial intelligence, by new ways of collecting data on a decentralized manner and validating it not through central control, but through various kinds of distributed ledger systems, allow one to imagine a radically different approach to data, both for research purposes and for policy purposes. Is this something that you find interesting? Do you have any comments on that kind of vision, or does it have the potential, while sounding attractive on the page or in a conversation, to actually become an even worse nightmare of panoptical control, to paraphrase Foucault on Bentham?
Yeah, no, thank you. Look, I think it comes down to who owns the data, who owns and who has access to it. And so, yes, social media, we're able to communicate with each other, but we also know it's on platforms that are owned by very rich people that can do, have been experimenting on our moods and our subjectivities and trying to change the ways we sort of respond to different advertising and different things that come up in our feeds, for example. So who owns the data, I think, is really important. And there is some really exciting and important research here in Australia coming from my First Nations colleagues around data sovereignty. And so, there's a long colonial history that sort of maps onto your comments, John, around, using data to control populations. That research in Australia has played a very crucial but dark role in controlling, assimilating, and attempts of elimination of First Nations people here in Australia. And so there's been big attempts for First Nations people to own the data. So when researchers go to communities or start or look at projects, that data goes back to communities, that it is owned and stored on country, and people make the decisions about it and use it in ways to advocate for the futures that they want to see. So that's a shift. But it's got a long way to go, and I think questions about who owns the data and what's the data being used for needs constant focus. So yes, these different technologies may be exciting, but they're also controlled within a system that supports elite interest by and large, and so democratizing that and socializing that, I think, is really the sort of crucial bit.
Thanks. Yeah, I really agree. And as perhaps UNESCO is strongly invested in this area of what we sometimes call responsible research and innovation, which is a term originally invented in Europe by the European Commission, but has become of broader application. And indeed, UNESCO is currently developing a recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence, which once it goes through the diplomatic process of negotiation, will be adopted by UNESCO's General Conference in November 2021, and will provide a benchmark on many of these issues of control, ownership, sovereignty with respect to data, particularly new kinds of data emerging from new kinds of data systems. But that will be a topic for a whole new podcast. Thank you very much, Elise, for this really interesting conversation on unconditional minimum incomes and the applications and implications. Thank you very much for joining us as an expert on the Inclusive Policy Lab podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure. Thank you.